Hi everyone, welcome to the Anti-Apathetic lecture this semester. Today we're delighted to introduce Akil from Resolve Collective. I couldn't think of a more suited collective to invite to the series this year. A bit about Resolve, they're an interdisciplinary practice to combine architecture, engineering, technology and arts with a focus towards addressing social issues. Their goal is to create change in our built environment that is just and equitable through the production of knowledge and ideas, and they collaborate and design with a lot of young people, especially those from underrepresented backgrounds, to drive this creation of a just environment. They see design as a physical implement as well as a systemic intervention, using a faith-based approach and community involvement to deliver their long-term projects. So, enough from me, over to you, Akil. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having me, everyone. And it was supposed to be my brother Seth who was supposed to be here, but he's ill, unfortunately, so I had to come in at the very last moment. So apologies for anything as disorganized as I imagine it's going to be. So today I'll be speaking a little bit about the practice and about our journey, and then I'll try and rattle through as many projects as I can in the remaining minutes. Does that sound alright? And then I guess we'll have questions and stuff. Yeah, I've been told that you guys have had a hard week, for a couple of weeks. I completely empathise with my students who are having a very tough time at the moment. I know it's like in term 2 especially. So things get messy. But yeah, so as for us, so my name is Akil, like I was introduced by Emma, and I'm part of Resolve Collective, which is an interdisciplinary design collective. We work between art, architecture, engineering and technology to address social issues. A lot of the work we do revolves around a design philosophy that we call using the site as a resource. And for us, it's the idea of how can we appraise and celebrate not just local materials, but also in local knowledges. Importantly, our practice comes from and stands on the shoulders of quite a few giants, actually. And so I'm from a place in South London called Streatham. I'm sure some of you know, well, maybe some of you don't, which is between Brixton and Croydon. So we've got Brixton in the north, we've got Croydon in the south, and that is the kind of world, the microcosm of those people who are from those places, like myself. And within that, we stand on the kind of shoulders of a number of different radical traditions. So a lot of the black movements from 1981 that paved a lot of the social infrastructure and ways for the generations afterwards are those that we stand on the shoulders of. Lots of thinkers, Caribbean thinkers, and practitioners, all of whom were engaged in internationalist struggles, all of whom stood for the kind of rights of the oppressed. And hence why our practice takes a lot of the stances that we do, hence why our practice is also inextricable from things like Palestinian liberation, and why our practice is always kind of involved, not just in the local but the translocal, and how we can be involved in those things and continue to support and show solidarity with those types of movements. So when we started working with young people, but this idea of how we can work with communities and design of the process took us to a number of different locations. And that expanded the practice in the way that I could go into. This idea of interdisciplinary design often means that what we are doing takes lots and lots of different forms. Sometimes it's very, very small kind of hyperlocal interventions within small spaces. Sometimes it's much larger projects that take place in big cultural institutions. It's always around making space for other practitioners, and we work within what we call an ecology of practice, so others with whom we are kind of deeply interconnected with and whom we kind of have this independence with as well. We always think about design as this process, so for us, we engage with this idea of thinking through making. It's very rare that you see the final product with us, but always this continuous process. Sometimes we also work within more formal architectural remits, so we're working with a number of different architectural studios on master planning projects or spatial policy projects, always with a remit to include the voices of local people. Sometimes and often we're working with materials as a means of trying to tell a story. So we're really interested in the types of stories that materials can tell us and the political history, the political narratives that those stories then reveal. Occasionally we work in a very permanent space. So it's not often that we work with permanent, but sometimes we do, and those can take the place of the public art, but also kind of more monumental status. And we're often engaged also in the digital space. So we're thinking about how the digital space can allow us to disseminate research and knowledge in different and interesting ways. It sounds like a plane is very powerful. It is a plane of architecture. So the projects take lots and lots of different forms. They also take on lots of different aesthetics, but they're always around this idea of the design of the process and the site of the resource, and that's something that we're zealous about. We're not necessarily committed to many ideas, but this idea that we can derive what we have from the resource and the site is really important to us. So we started on our journey in Brixton, and in 2016 in Brixton, the wider context of this place was really determining a lot of the moves that we were making. We were part of this unofficial practice ecology, which involved many different practitioners, basically none of whom were architects. All of whom were engaged in changing space, all of whom were engaged in trying to kind of better our local area. And so we were thinking about how we reclaim space in the face of gentrification. 2015 was around the kind of apex of the Save the Arches campaign in Brixton as well. We were also part of this second wave of a lot of what was happening within the Olympics as well. And so there were infrastructures that had happened as a result of the displacement, but also the kind of investment in certain areas that then led to the types of practices that we see around us, practices like Assemble, like Exist, etc. And we were part of a second wave of practitioners who were working with temporary spaces, meanwhile spaces, for better and for worse, really. And this project was Rebel Space, so it was a temporary pavilion in St Matthew's Church Gardens, where we tried to work for 7 days and 7 nights to put on a series of events, but also use materials that we could find from within a mile radius of the site. And so for us at the time, this idea of using materials that we could source locally wasn't just a way of thinking about climate justice. In fact, actually, that wasn't really within our kind of vocabulary. Really, the main thing was that we didn't have a car, right? We didn't have a car, and we didn't have any money. And so we could only work with the things that we had. That also forced us into a space of thinking about things programmatically, and actually how we could carve up and divide time, thinking about how we could link in the practices of those others, to think about programming the space, not as a byproduct of the space, but actually contingent on the space, was really important. The first few years of our existence, we existed in a really informal space, obviously, but we also only existed in South London. We only existed in Brixton, really, and we didn't have a remit to do anything else. So if you had asked us at the time, do you guys want to be working in certain name of places that we're working in now, for example, we wouldn't have been able to even dream that far. Actually, the reality was that we were in our home, and we were trying to work in our home. And that idea of hyperlocal working is something that stuck. So this second project was when we were working in the market, and we were really interested in the banana boxes, which are a really amazing kind of market infrastructure. They're used in Brixton Market. Oh, thank you for silence. They're used in Brixton Market for everything other than banana boxes, right? So they use tables, chairs, plinths, water mitigation, beauty trainers, and we were really interested in the flexibility with which they were being used, and sought to turn them into an internal structure within an abandoned arch within Brixton Market. And this became a place for lots of different programs around food and industries of food within Brixton and within London, but also thinking about Afro-Caribbean identity and how this centres on the production and the consumption of food products from around the world. This space hosted and facilitated the practices of lots of others with whom we have a kind of really deep reverence for, and it actually, importantly, had lots of different parties. And so when I show this slide, and I say this a lot now because I think it's probably important, but when I show this slide, now that we operate in much more formal places, so for example, I teach at the Architecture Association with my brother Seth, we're honorary fellows of the Royal Institute of British Architecture, whatever the fuck that means, and so we're often in spaces where we're presenting to people who are super serious. They've got the real circular glasses, you know what I mean, with the circular Le Corbusier glasses, and they're looking at us very, very sternly, and I'm showing these slides, and I used to show the slides and think, these guys aren't going to take us seriously. Right? These guys are not going to take us seriously, they're going to think we're party players. But actually, the important thing for me about this slide in particular is that this space doesn't exist anymore, number one. And actually, there's no trace of this space ever existing. If you were to look in the same place now in Brixton, you wouldn't find any trace of it ever having happened. Brixton has changed irreparably. And actually, Brixton and the changes of Brixton forced us and a number of other people out of that space. And so when I see this, I see an archive. In some ways, I kind of see an archive of a space for black joy within a city that kind of consistently reaffords and repackages that as a luxury. And so I've become increasingly fond of the party side as time goes by. Trying to use design as a way of platforming things was always really important for us, and actually that preceded how we worked as artists or practitioners. Really we saw ourselves as creating spaces for others, And that was really important for us. This is the work of Shola Olulade, an amazing British Nigerian artist who first showed her work in this space, and it was really part of that package, or really part of the idea to become infrastructural. The first time we ever actually didn't work in Brixton, and also in the UK, we worked in Sheffield. And Sheffield has since become a kind of sister city for us. It's a place that we work lots and lots and lots. We really see it as somewhere that's very close to us because it grew our practice. It's become somewhere that we have a very deep solidarity with. Our ecology stretches it far and wide into this city. And we were really interested in how we can continue to grow that. When we first were working there, we were interested in this idea of citizen composite imagery, so Kevin Lynch's idea from the image of the city. But really taking this outside of a planning context, we were interested in the performativity of collective mapping. And so working with different groups around the Park Hill estate with which we were working, we came across this method of emotional mapping, or we invented this method of emotional mapping, by which we were able to kind of see the city through other people's eyes and platform the subjectivity of others within the city. This revealed not an objective image, but a deeply subjective and contested understanding of Sheffield. We wanted to work through the nooks and the crannies and through the contestation, through the paradoxes of this place, in order to really settle in there, in order to become situated in this space. We then built from the map in some ways, so we carved up the gallery space in which we were working, using materials that we begged, borrowed and stole from a network of different art spaces across Sheffield. We then built these installations which tried to reveal people's emotional connections to the city, thinking about things like performance into the city, narrative in the city, understanding Sheffield as this city of stories, the story of steel and industrialization, the story of sports, but actually what are the sub-narratives that pretend these larger narratives of race, of gender, of ableism, and what do they do to contribute to the city that we know as Sheffield? And so Sheffield really became our city in some ways. And from this we started to progress a translocal approach, both continuing to work in our own area, but thinking about how we could work from the learnings of others as well. So, this emotional mapping technique, I suppose, also became a way in which we sought to understand lots of other areas. This is an example of how we digitalize that emotional mapping technique to think about how we can receive people's emotional connections to areas through a master planning approach, and working with a series of different architectural studios on a master plan for a place called Purley Way in Croydon. What am I doing? How am I doing for time? Good? Yeah. Okay. So, to think about addressing this idea of anti-apathetic architecture, and to think about where our place is in this, really what I wanted to try and do in this next rattle of projects, much more recent than the last one, is to think about the subplots that run through those projects. Often our projects have one face and then another. They're kind of Janus face in some ways. And there's always something running between those projects. That makes it very difficult for clients to get hold of, and actually it sounds a little bit sexier than it actually is. But actually the idea of the messiness of the process, the open-endedness of the process, is always a way in which we're trying to engage people and work to covertly think through people's space within institutions, within local areas, and often this kind of comes through the veins of the project. So these are what I'm going to try and tie in through a certain series of different projects here. The first project that we did in Hamburg in last year, and this was a project where we were designing an exhibition in Hamburg, an exhibition about water. The exhibition called Wasserbotschaften, so water messages, and the exhibition was around a series of objects, many of which were extraordinarily old, like really 1,000 years old kind of objects, from across the world, all telling the stories of human connections to water. But we were also really interested in what are those human connections to water in Hamburg right now. And how do people connect to not only the city but also to water? We landed on this neighborhood called Wilhelmsburg, which is actually a series of islands in the River Elbe which runs to the city of Wilhelmsburg, and actually reflects a population which is much more similar to the population that I grew up around in Strand. A kind of hyper-diverse situation in which people from all across the world have not only stories of water because of the places that they live, but also stories of water from their hometowns, from their diaspora. And so working on a series of mapping, thinking through these waters as well, but also digging up clay from the River Elbe and turning this into a workshop in local schools by which we were using tangible means of thinking through people's connections to the water. We started on this subplot that ran coterminously with the design of the exhibition. Meanwhile, in the exhibition, we were thinking about how we could work just within the confines of what we were doing. And so we set ourselves a challenge and we set the museum a task. We said that we're only going to design using the stuff that's in the exhibition before us. So this was what the exhibition looked like before we got there. This was a completely different exhibition. And when we said that, the museum was like, great, it's amazing, climate justice, yay. And what it turned out to be was a very, very messy process, extremely difficult. Turns out it's much easier to make new shit than it is to use old stuff. And so we embarked upon a journey of trying to see the new in this old, working with lots of different groups, again within Wilhelmsburg, lots of alternative educational providers as well. We tried to think through ways of carving the identity of those in the space and matching that with these objects which told stories from across the world. And this is how it started to end up. We tried to kind of see infinitesimal possibility within small changes to tables and chairs. How can we flip, change, divide, readjust and rearrange the space as it is in order to create an infinite amount of new possibilities? We were also able to cheekily weave those subplots back into the spaces, taking the sculptures from the kids and placing them into the same vitrines of these objects, which were sometimes thousands of years old. And again, another project that looks at these sub-narratives, these subplots, is a project in Woolwich in 2021. And for this project we designed a competition by which we were trying to encourage non-designers, people who weren't professional designers, to design a series of temporary sculptures and public artworks within the town of Woolwich. We were really interested in Woolwich's naval history and naval colonial history, and worked very closely with the Royal Borough of Greenwich, but also the Woolwich Action Heritage Zone, which is the kind of archival arm of the Heritage England, to set a series of briefs throughout Woolwich, through which people would respond. But we saw ourselves, our practice as the infrastructure. Our practice was the thing that was going to also help those to create these spaces, to create these installations, but more importantly also to act as an administrative layer. And I think what's important, especially when it comes to working with local communities, when it comes to working with people who aren't familiar with those aspects of design, is how can you start to pad out the layers of administration, which are often the sources of violence, which are often the sources of inability for those who are trying to create locally. And so that was part of this task. We ended up with a series of really amazing installations, all made from salvaged materials across the town centre. But almost more amazing than the installations themselves is that everyone who entered the competition chose, of all the places that they could choose in Woolwich, everyone chose these really grotty alleys, these dirty, rat-infested, piss-stained, drug-infested alleys. And actually so much so that the council turned to us and at some point tried to dissuade us from doing it. They said, don't do this. They said, these alleys are too fucking dirty. We can't police these. We're going to have to call a stop to this. And what I found really interesting about that, having then been able to persuade the council to do this, was that these spaces, which are often thought of as the dregs of urbanism, right, the kind of shadowy spaces in the background of our minds, are actually in the forefront of local community. People who are working and living in these spaces all the time, they are constantly thinking through these spaces. Their agency constantly reforms and shapes these spaces. And this was just an insight into how to do those things. So we had murals from the likes of Daniel Thompson and also a 14-year-old school child called Jesse Oshogwe, who was really interested in the river and how the river acted as this a means of kind of guiding him as he came from Nigeria to Woolwich. Sarah Garrett, who made from these vegetable boxes these cyanotype prints of women who were coming down Myrtle Alley and lit these up in the dark. And it was really amazing to see people kind of traversing these as these images kind of shone through the darkness. Peter Murray and Luka Schmajkovic, who were teachers and had created out of these old a mountain of tires, which was really imaginatively called Tire Mountain by local communities, and created this vision of the river and the proximity of the river to this site. And the river is only about 150 meters away from this site. Woolwich and the urban grain of Woolwich is really blocked off from the river, despite being kind of really on the river. So this is a really amazing way of doing those things. The third project, I told you I was going to rattle through these projects. The third project is a project in Brighton that we did in 2022. And here we were kind of commissioned by the Brighton CCA, which was an amazing contemporary gallery. It's no longer in Brighton, to take over this space. And we were really interested in Brighton and the industry of leisure. The industry of leisure in Brighton and the kind of story that tells Victorian leisure and the kind of the superfluousness that comes with that idea of leisure, but actually the contemporary black communities that live and exist in Woolwich as well. So we wanted to create this paradox, this space which was built out of industrial material from the surrounding areas, but also which platformed spaces for black leisure. And working in seasons, we partnered up with different black organisations across Brighton to try and build out those stories. It was a really amazing way of trying to speak through those materials. And like I said, we're always trying to think about ways in which materials are telling a story. So these materials from Port Slade, the surrounding areas, also told the story of kind of employment and migration in Brighton, and how the peripheries of this space become very industrial, whilst the kind of centre of the metropole becomes a place for leisure and enjoyment. We were working, I'm going to meet this, we worked with lots and lots of different organisations, also students as well, to build coterminies, to co-design the space. And the space became a platform for lots of different events. Groups like Afori Books, who we partnered with, which is the largest black book organisation in the UK, and also an amazing sound system called Rastafari Love, who are an amazing sound system who've been working for decades across the southeast of England, and to platform and to also kind of throw parties and to celebrate in the space as well. And the space shifted and changed with the intervention. So there was a real kind of non-preciousness to this space, a way in which people could really reclaim and make that space its own, coming from the hardness of the industrial past. The next project is actually one of the first times that we really tried to define and to concretize this idea of working as an infrastructure. And like I said a couple of times, we work alongside what we call as practice ecology. It's really a kind of cloud of different practitioners from across the UK, all of whom are looking to work in different ways of systems change, and are heavily inspired by those around us. So people that stretch as far wide as Birmingham, Liverpool, Sheffield, Brighton, etc. And we are consistently trying to make space for those groups, but also to platform and to celebrate those groups as well. Because we can't leave it until we're done to celebrate those groups, right? We're in a stage of our lives of Resolve, we're in an 8th year of Resolve. And between the 8th and 10th year of most black or community-focused organisations in this country is when they die. We're in the black death period of our life, right? So we're staring our demise in the corner. And so for that reason, we really want to continuously make spaces to celebrate the work of one another. This was and I've talked over the thing, it's gone. This was we worked very closely with a group called Skin Deep, who are a race and culture magazine, and we commissioned a series of artists in London, Birmingham and Sheffield to respond to this idea of social infrastructure in their areas. So we were working very closely with Coram's Fields, who are a youth centre in Camden. We worked with Maya, who are an amazing liberation organisation, and commissioned a film that documented the work of Maya in Birmingham. And we also commissioned a series of different artists in Sheffield to respond to the archive of the Windrush generation in Sheffield with visual elements and also sonic and video elements as well. And this became this first foray, not into just delivering the projects ourselves, but how do we facilitate the work of others in a very serious way by commissioning these projects, by platforming and celebrating these projects. That stretched last year into something entirely in a different gear, really. We were able to raise enough money from a selection of funders and different kind of pots and things to create our own residency called Nurturing Ecologies, which we held in Sheffield. We invited a series of practitioners, black, POC and marginalised practitioners from across the UK to Sheffield for a week for a peer-to-peer knowledge exchange where we were leaning on the work of one another. So we're thinking about how we could contribute to each other's practices in ways that we are often commissioned to do for other people. We are very rarely asked to turn our tools inwards, or given the space to turn our tools inwards, the space to test and to iterate and to experiment. And this became part of that remit. And so we had these practitioners here for a week. I went on a series of really amazing kind of journeys with one another, one of which this film kind of shows was run by Evie Muir, who runs Peaks of Colour in Sheffield, and Shaheen Kazmani as well, who's an educator and practitioner in London. And they came together for a walk through the peaks, but also to lead a workshop called Healing Recipes, which were recipes about healing that have been passed on by generations. So to think and appraise through the intergenerational knowledge which shapes some of our interpersonal practices, and to think about how we could give space to those recipes and space to those practices. A number of the different workshops from this have kind of now been born into other things, into exhibitions that are going on in Sheffield at the moment, into commissioned projects which are going on in London as well. And so we were really trying to create the substrate for this possibility, to create the kind of fertile grounds through which other things can grow. And I think despite our continued kind of fascination with being in places, with intervening in places, with building, which is what we love to really do, actually we kind of see a means of our practice and as a vehicle, and like I keep saying, this infrastructure for growing the work around us. There is a reality that we aren't going to be here for forever. And actually, you wouldn't want us here forever. We'd get old and smutty, and we'd start kind of accepting OBEs and shit. You know, we'd turn into the villains. And actually, so how do we kind of start to grow the seeds of other practices as we kind of traverse this journey, and to think about our own obscurity, our own demise in more serious ways? How am I doing, Simon?
Yeah.
I'm doing okay? Okay, I'll do 2 more, and then I'll stop. And so this project, returning to the idea of delivering this project was in 2019, where we were working with the Science Gallery and the Science Gallery's young advisors to think through this idea of anxiety. They were really interested in anxiety as a twofold phenomena, both this experience of cultural anxiety, which is the loss of one's identity within large urban areas, and also the neurological experience of anxiety as well. Working with researchers and psychologists from King's College London, we came across this idea of weaving as a physical activity being the nexus of those joint experiences of anxiety, and using materials that we sourced from within and around the gallery, so different kind of clothes shops and donated clothes from the gallery. We turned old clothes into reconstituted yarn, which became these loom walls within the gallery space. We then wove through the gallery space a series of diasporic fabrics that we had sourced from markets across London, markets like Shepherd's Bush, Ridley Road, Brixton, Seven Sisters, all places which held in them some symbolic importance when it came to this idea of identity. And people were able to weave physically through the space, undoing and redoing elements of the space to make it amorphous, to allow it to start to sag and to grow with the movements of bodies that kind of physically wove through it. The subplot of this story was that we were working very closely throughout with a group called the Latin American Youth Forum, who are part of a group called IRMO, who work out of Angelstown in Brixton. We're actually working in Angelstown at the moment. And this was such an amazing group of young people who work within this group IRMO, who are an amazing social infrastructure for Latin Americans who come to the country, often through another country, who often come through Spain. And so they're dependent on groups like these, civil society groups like these, for housing rights, for legal aid, for education, and the work that they do isn't public-facing work. So there was a bit of a tussle with the gallery in some ways, because this was a kind of gem for them, this way of kind of really shining and celebrating the work that these people are doing, but in a way that wasn't necessarily sensitive to the sensitivities of those groups. So we worked in a much more covert way. We worked in a way by which we were creating loom walls that would exist in their space, in Angelstown, and in a space that didn't try to expose or to create unwanted exposure in a highly kind of public space. I'll make this the very last one. And then last but not least, this was a project in 2020 where we were invited by the Kunstverein in Braunschweig, a town in Germany, to respond to the legacy of an Ghanaian German philosopher who had lived in that town in the 17th century, called Anton Wilhelm Amo. And Anton Wilhelm Amo was a really amazing figure. He was a dualist, so much like Leibniz and Descartes, he believed in this kind of separation of mind and body, and had a bunch of different kind of weird, wacky theories, but also had a really interesting life and archive. And so we were invited to respond to that archive, but wanted to do it in a way that disseminated that and worked really closely with people who were living in the town at the time. And so we began by planning a series of workshops and material tests with a local school, Francis Feld. And this then birthed a space which was made from found materials processed in ways that responded to his philosophical inquiry. So this idea of working passively and impassively. How do we process materials in ways that embody the passive and the impassive alongside the lines and the philosophies of Anton Wilhelm Amo? The space also became an archive. That was for 2 reasons. One was because we got kicked out of Germany. It was 2020 and everyone was to remember the pandemic. And so we left and were able to work digitally as a way to connect a lot of the archival journey, not just of Anton Wilhelm Amo, but also of the lives of African Europeans between the 16th and 19th century, particularly those who lived within the royal court. So really 2 things that don't seem coterminous, really 2 things that don't seem to align with one another. But we found within that a wealth of different archives, a wealth of different stories and journeys and work that we tried to platform. We were also able to kind of work synchronously with things that were going on. This intersected with the German decolonial moment at the time. So in places like Berlin, they were renaming lots of streets that had otherwise been named after lots of pejorative words for black people and Africans. And so there was a way in which the digital here bridged those gaps. And these are just elements of the space that were left as well. So like I said, we got kicked out of the space during the process. But what that allowed us to do was to keep things as we had left them. So we literally got shoved out of Germany at this time. And we were able to leave the workshop that we had been using to create that space in the gallery. And as the country reopened, people were able to continue on those journeys, to continue on the material processing, and to continue filling out the space. And here are some examples of the types of material processing that were going on, where they were turning sand into brick by using PVA glue in ovens, with a return to this idea of ecology of fabric, and others. I'm not going to keep going because I think I might be out of time.
Yeah.
Cool, okay.
Thank you. Perhaps maybe one question.
Yeah.
More
More than one question if need be.
Any questions?
I think it's really interesting when you talk about like emotional mapping and like I guess like uncovering emotional responses to the built environment, because I think that like especially like in more like traditional architecture circles, the only emotional response is almost like awe of like something beautiful. And I wondered what you learned from hearing people talk about their emotional responses and how you think that might influence like what we're doing in like a more traditional like architecture setting.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot of interest in. We often find a lot of interest in this emotional mapping process, particularly within like, the fields of spatial policy and stuff. And so my background is in, I studied architecture and also urban design. And I worked as an urban designer for Croydon Council as well. So a very kind of traditional, I suppose, like built environment background. And there's always been this friction with how we translate, particularly emotional mapping, because it's this really febrile process. Actually, it's the process to be sat with and to situate oneself in. It's very difficult to draw kind of quantitative information from that. And we did try. So when we digitalized that process and created websites and kind of digital platforms through which to do that, there was this effort to try and quantify this, to feed this into spatial policy. So the context of the Pearly Wave Finders digital platform, we were working on a master plan which was looking at all this industrial space and thinking about the co-location of different types of employment spaces within that industrial space and also green space. So lots of different kind of big urban planning questions. And actually there was a friction there because a lot of the things that people felt were contradictory. They would contradict each other. And what emotional mapping does really beautifully, I find, is to platform and to visibilize this contradiction. But what it doesn't do is to solve that. What it doesn't do is try and resolve those things as well. And so we're often in this tug of war between how we feed those things into the wider powers and how do we keep and cherish and kind of celebrate those things as well. And it's quite open-ended. I would suppose we have an answer in some ways. Sometimes there are ways of pulling out certain aspects of experience. Often it's actually a way of kind of forming and thinking through something yourself as a practitioner as well. And what do you take from that as a practitioner, working in this area by which you're kind of feeling the contradictions of those areas. We have the real privilege of working across the world, but also across the UK really intensely. So at the moment we're working in Liverpool, a place called Nelson in East Lancashire as well, which is really cool. We're working in Angetown Estate in Brixton, and we're also doing some work on the South Coast. And in all these places we've had some element of emotional mapping, and it all reveals lots of different kind of rhythms to the city. What that then does for an actual physical building, maybe nothing, right? I don't know. But I think it's a task of us to, in some way, to continue to kind of scratch at those inquiries and find out. I think it's an open-ended process. It's not something that we have IP for. As for most things, we don't sell work or have like a kind of TM trademark on the stuff. So those are things that anyone can pick up and just do. And I think there's something quite nice in seeing how that starts to float away from us as well.
Any more questions?
Really simple questions, like how much money does that make? Not much.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
Like, how do you see your collective moving forward from now? In terms of, obviously most of it are like blue law spaces, they're quite temporary. So how do you see it, and what is your hope kind of like to make it a more permanent type of, architecture?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's really. I'm glad you asked that question because. So I guess when we started, there was this kind of acceptance from a lot of kind of architecture groups that permanence was something we were disallowed from. Actually, meanwhile space and temporary intervention was the currency of this time. And actually, when we came as a second wave of those practitioners that were doing that, we weren't really thinking about permanence in that way. I think as we started to develop, some people around us actually went into more permanent ways of working. And some groups actually formalized in ways that became more kind of formal architectural studios. And we hung in the balance of this kind of riffraff, kind of going to and from this informality. I think like that journey for us has revealed, to me at the very least, this could be wrong, that actually there's a false dichotomy between temporariness and permanence. The opposite of temporariness isn't permanence, not for me. I actually think that those two things can exist in the same way. And actually when I think about things that are central to my identity, like for example Notting Hill Carnival, this is a thing which is highly temporary, it only happens for 2 days of the year, but it's permanent, it's a continuous feature, and it's cyclic, it's seasonal, and to think about things through that lens also starts to problematize this dichotomy of sensory of permanence and temporariness. The acceptance and the understanding of that, and also the radical possibility that's allowed for by temporary work, I think is what engages us. And our permanence is actually the legacy that those things leave in some way. So by growing the practices of others around us, by fostering and facilitating the practices of people that are coming after us, which is something that the generation before us didn't really do, I think that is this way of achieving legacy, permanence. I don't know if for us, I'd be shocked if we ever built like a building from scratch, right? I'd be extraordinarily shocked. I probably wouldn't be involved in it. Because I think there's also enough buildings in the world. I think actually the question is how we use the space that exists for us right now. And actually by challenging ourselves to ask and to act on those questions, is this means of disrupting the idea of the temporary and what's permanent. I think there are so many other kind of visions for how we might transform our society. I think that actually when I look at some of those installations that last for a day or a week or a month, for me there's something permanent in that. There's a permanence into the legacy that left, or the permanence into the type of practices that it was able to foster that I see now working, when I see groups like Paul Collective working, when I see groups like Patch and stuff who are all kind of doing these things, I see a sense of permanence in that. I hopefully speak for the rest of the collective in this. I don't lust to be the OMAs and the things of this world. Not that there's a problem with OMA, but that's not our trajectory. I think our trajectory is something else.
There is a problem with OMA.
Are there any more student questions?
I kind of just want to say that, like, I think as well your documentation is something that's of your projects feels quite permanent in a way, and that it's a kind of everlasting record of what you did. And the way you use photography is like you capture quite a lot of emotion and a lot of feeling in that exact moment in your photography, and your documentation of your projects is really interesting and something that you don't often see in more traditional architectural photography and documentation.
Thank you. Yeah, I actually hate our documentation. I think that's really bad. So I'm glad that you said that because it gives us a little bit of sense of hope. I think that when we're thinking about how we document the process, because obviously I said the thing about our design being the process, the documentation of that is quite important. I think that, to be completely frank, like when we were, especially within the first period of us working, I feel of it, when I reflect on it now, I think about it almost like, like the first 7 seconds of the universe, right? When like gravity was a little bit different, when time was a bit flexible, when everything, all the rules that govern physical reality today weren't so then. This was this time of kind of complete vagueness. Everything was in this cloud of the early time. And we weren't working in a way that tried to document things. We were working in a way that we were just trying to do something. Everyone was just trying to do something, and that happened to be in our own local area, and it happened to be with our own local community. As things have progressed, and we've been fortunate enough to work across the UK, across the world. Last year we were working in Palestine, in Ramallah, in Cameroon, in Malmo, in Sweden, all these kind of places. We have felt this kind of real need to document and archive our work and the work of those around us. Because actually, as I said, like the shoulders of the giants that we stand on, these are giants of 81, the 81 uprisings in Brixton, in Toxteth, in Handsworth. A lot of that work wasn't documented. a lot of those groups, the Brixton Black Women's Group, the Brixton Black Panthers, FOAD, these groups are entirely undocumented. They didn't have their remit was not to document themselves, and as a result of that, their message got co-opted, and there was an aporia of time, this kind of like gap in which we had to scramble around to get those fragments. And we're only just getting into a time where those things are coming back. The Black Archive of 81 is only just coming back. June Giovanni, who runs Mayday Rooms and also a black, kind of really integral black filmmaker, just got her flowers the other day with the BAFTA. There's this moment which is starting to piece together that time, and much of it has been lost. And I think that there was a danger of that happening for us as well. There's a danger that's kind of not just romantic, but real when I go back to Brixton and I see a place that I don't recognise. There's a reality in this idea that a lot of the things that were done are no longer there, and a lot of the memory kind of exists, and that kind of goes against this idea of permanence in some way. So I think that there's something urgent when it comes to this idea of documentation for us, but I don't know if we're yet responding to it as urgently as we should.
Student questions first.
Oh, right.
This hierarchy still the inverse hierarchy.
Yeah.
I would have counted others.
Do you have a question? Yeah.
I'm sorry. I think that, I'm sorry that I disagree with what you just said. That you were talking about like what you built isn't there anymore, and you think that in a way kind of goes against the permanence, but I think it's wrong because it also kind of extends beyond just the people that were involved there, but who they tell and like how the experiences shape the individuals and how that expands in ways that you wouldn't imagine. So I think, this reminds me of a quote from Maya Angelou. She said, I'm just paraphrasing it, but it was something around, you won't remember what people said, but you will remember how they made you feel. And that kind of shapes you as you go and find your identity in a way. So I think that it is for me.
Beautiful. What's your name?
Cindy.
I'll quote you when we're dead and gone. Sung by the RBN.
Any more student questions?
Yeah, no, it's just really interesting, like talking about that, like permanence and like spatial permanence versus like how do these things. I really like that thing of like the Nottingham Carnival, like being recurring, and even though it's like temporary, it does have this thing. But like I think for Nottingham Carnival, there's this part of it is like reliability that it's going to come back, and I wonder like so with a lot of your stuff. I mean, I see you've done stuff that's then like maybe toured a couple of different places and stuff, but like a lot of them have like a life and then they go and they've got this kind of afterlife. But I do wonder like when you talk to people about this kind of placemaking work, there's like part of that sense of place is the idea of being able to like the stability of it and being able to return to it. And like you say, with like the changes in South London, there's like places can become unrecognisable, and that's like a whole battle in and of itself. And I wonder like how, when you've done these kind of commissions that you know are going to have like a shelf life, but you're also trying to work with communities, like what's that tension kind of like?
Yeah, that is the tension. Yeah, that is completely the tension. I think that there's when we were kind of first starting out, and like Meanwhile Space as a term was really kind of hitting off. And Meanwhile Space has been around for a while since then. Actually, 2009 was the first Meanwhile Space report, and that had come around that was kind of like just in the legacy of the economic crash and thinking about talent-centered regeneration. But really, it was at this point that it was everywhere. It was in newspapers as well as being in kind of like architectural review and stuff. And there was also a moment where there was a reflection on what does that mean to have short-term intervention in order to achieve long-term social benefit. And whether or not that can actually happen. And actually there's lots of schools of thought, many of which I kind of semi-agree with, that's not really possible. I don't know how it could be possible to do those things but leave these kind of long-lasting legacies. I think that in some ways, as well as the kind of experience and the way that people are able to kind of feel and interact with those things, for us when we are doing these interventions, because of the collaborative and the collective approach to how we make those things, it's never just us coming in and building these things, we're often building with people. We're building with people in those areas. There's a way of also reflecting a sense of agency, a pre-existing agency that people do have. and a message that's sent to this idea that people can change those spaces. That message, I think, is made difficult by the idea that we weren't able to change our space. We weren't able to change the tide of our space, and actually, if you had come to us in 2017, I would have said that we're bringing Brixton back, I guarantee you, and we didn't do that, none of us did. But there is that sort of makes things romantic, right? The idea that nothing is clear cut, and actually there are ways of existing in kind of multiple realities at the same time. And so I think actually the process, by engaging people in that process, by engaging in ways that reveal existing agency, I think we are able in some ways to at least address an idea of longer lasting legacy. All right.
Thank you. I think that will have to be the last question for tonight. Please join me in